Welcome to Ann Arbor Democracy, a place for conversation about how our local leaders are elected and how political decisions are made, what this looked like in the past, and what it looks like now. This project aims to explore the recent history and current reality of Ann Arbor democracy. Historically, the city of Ann Arbor has included significant communities of color. For decades, many African American families lived in neighborhoods on the north and west side. Residents in areas we now call Kerrytown and Water Hill were over 35% non-white. In the 1950s, one neighborhood was targeted for Urban Renewal, a policy designed to theoretically improve a community by removing blight. An urban renewal plan would have demolished structures and rebuilt new. Urban renewal did not ultimately move forward in this area of the city, but some African American families were still forced to sell the homes that they owned. In the late 1960s, plans for a new road called the Packard Beakes Bypass threatened to cut the neighborhood in half. In the 1970s, a new program called Model Cities provided federal money to improve and support neighborhoods rather than displacing residents. Model Cities funding helped support health clinics, legal services, daycare, job training, and after-school programs. During this period of activism in Ann Arbor, members of the Black community challenged power structures in our schools and local government. That story is best told by the people who lived through it. What follows is a conversation I had with Shirley Beckley in October 2023.
Well, my name is Shirley Beckley. I also went by Shirley Gully because I married Hathaway Gully. That was my second marriage. And so a lot of people in the 60s and 70s knew me as Shirley Gully. And then when I got a divorce, I went back to my maiden name, Shirley Beckley. I think I describe myself as an activist first, and then a historian of the Black community.
I like that.
And that's how I, because I've done a lot of community work. I've worked with legal aid, and then I worked with Model Cities Legal Services. So I've worked with the legal, I've worked with Ann Arbor Housing, and from that I went on and took a course and became a housing director myself in Lansing and in Muskegon. But I was born and raised here, and my family came here. My father came, I think, in the 30s sometime, 1930-something, from Mississippi. And it was a little place called Pontotoc, Mississippi. And the Beckleys had a lot of property. They still do down there. They built a church, they got a cemetery, and I've been there to visit my father's people and seen all this stuff. So it's that's an interesting story. And then he came here, and then he brought his mother and his siblings. And then my mother's side, they came in the late 1800s, and they came by way of Milan and Ypsilanti, and they were in Ypsilanti. But I remember my mother and her cousins didn't have any cars, so they would take the Greyhound bus to come to work, which was day work, in Ann Arbor. And so my mother said it just became so taxing because then you had to walk the rest of the way. So she said they decided to try to move to Ann Arbor. So that's how they came from Ypsi to Ann Arbor. And because there was work, they could do day work. They couldn't do, of course, anything else back then.
What do you describe as day work? What is that?
Cleaning homes.
Oh, okay.
Housework. Cooking. After she bought the house, she got married to my stepfather. Now, around this time, I'm about 8 years old. And so we moved to 115 West Kingsley Street. And it was a 2-bedroom, had a basement. It had a coal furnace. I remember him taking the wheelbarrow. Him and other Black men in the community would take their wheelbarrows and go down to the train station and get the coal off the trains to put in the furnace.
Oh, wow.
It was really, I remember stuff like that. I remember our milk being delivered on the porch in a little container in glass bottles, 2 glass bottles. That's what was your milk. Now, my mother worked for the Bonestills, and the Bonestills were big-time Republicans here.
Wow.
And very much involved in the politics. I think Mr. Bonestill, I don't know if he was a city attorney, but I know his son, Bonnie Jr., was at one time. But they had a lot of influence. And Guy Larkham and Mr. Bonestill had a lot of influence with each other. And in talking about that, that's when in the late 60s, well, let's see, my mother died in 1966. And around 1968 is when the Urban Renewal came in. My mother worked as someone that worked in homes. She worked for the Bonestills. She cooked and cleaned for them. My stepfather was the gardener and the chauffeur for Mr. Bonestill.
Wow.
And when their children had children, when they had grandchildren, then they wanted me to be the babysitter for the I told them, nope, buck stops here. I'm not doing nothing for you.
Good for
I'm
you.
I'm out of it. I babysat a couple times, but I was like, no, I'm not going to be a part of this. So, but it was, and my mother, the thing that bothered me about the Bonestills, my mother had gotten really sick and she couldn't work. And Mrs. Bonestill called one day, not to ask how she was, but when was she coming back to work? And so I got upset and told her she's not coming back. And my mom's in the background. Don't now, Shirley. Now, wait a minute, Shirley. I said. But I was so upset that she didn't care about her health. But shortly after that, my mom passed away. So she didn't go back anyway. But my stepfather continued working for him.
I have seen a lot of articles about this Packard Beakes Bypass.
Mm-hmm.
And other than sort of a convenient cut through, the piece of the story that you're telling me that's new that I've not read anything about is this, the property that was needed to make it happen and what that looked like, mapping it out and approaching the property owners. The city came up with this plan and there was a lot of pushback, or at
Yes.
least there was a lot of debate
Well,
among even the politicians about whether or not it should happen.
Well, a lot of the churches, the black churches, the black community raised up through the churches. And, they didn't want it to happen. I had gotten a divorce and me and my kids were living there. And that was on Kingsley, West Kingsley. And they decided they were going to do a Packard Beakes Bypass. And they decided to take these homes. And I was working for the city at the time, and so the secretary said, do you want to see this document? It's about your house. And I said, sure. And they weren't only taking the property, they said they were taking everything inside the house. And I said, oh, no. They offered my stepfather $10,000. I told him, well, don't take it, because they don't want the house, they want the property. And the property's worth more than 10. I said, my mother paid 12. So 10 is less than what you paid for it. Now, I was telling him not to sell, but then that's when they told us that they would take it by eminent domain.
Yeah.
And that we wouldn't have a choice and they'd condemn it and just take it. And then because of the protest about the situation, they never built it. But they did take other properties. And, they convinced people to sell their homes. And that's how we kind of lost the west side. Then they renamed it Water Hill, and that's why we were so upset, those of us that grew up, because the new tenants of the old West Side didn't even include us in renaming it. They just came in and renamed it. And so that was kind of a stab in the heart, we thought. We still think that.
What did you call it, or did you have a name for the neighborhood?
It's the West Side.
The West Side.
Yeah. And that's where they allowed us to live. And when I say allowed us, I mean that was 4th and 5th Ave and Beakes. Mm-hmm. West Kingsley, not East Kingsley, West Kingsley. Gott Street, Spring, Fountain, Daniel, Minor, Summit, Felch, all of that it was a mixture. A lot of Greek people that lived there, and a lot of black people because we went to school together. It was interesting. We were friends in school, but we didn't do anything together afterwards. And so there was this little friction going on. But we continued. Slauson let us use their gym as a roller skating rink. And so I was one of the supervisors, would take the kids on Friday night, and we'd go to Slauson, and they could roller skate. And then Jones School, that we are celebrating its 100 years, we would have dances. We had a incident at Slauson, so we couldn't go to Slauson anymore, so we continued roller skating at Jones School in their gym. And we also had dances because the kids back then, well, it was opening up a little more, but when I was a teenager, we couldn't go to the Y dances. Black kids couldn't.
Oh, wow.
So we had our own dances at the Dunbar Center. That's where we went after school for educational purposes, and then on Fridays we'd have dances. So even though we knew there were places we couldn't go, I think our parents and the community and the black church just sort of protected us, and we didn't worry about it. It wasn't any place. We didn't feel bad that we couldn't. We just knew we couldn't. Like there was the Sugar Bowl on Main Street, which was a restaurant. Even though his daughter, the Precatys, owned the Sugar Bowl, his daughter went to Pioneer with us, but blacks couldn't come in that restaurant. So we didn't go because we knew we couldn't. Places we couldn't go, we didn't go.
What was you're talking about the Sugar Bowl and being a pioneer. What time frame are we talking about?
Well, I graduated in 1960. So you couldn't go there when I was between the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Like after our games, our football and basketball games, the coaches sometimes would take the players to the Sugar Bowl, but the black players couldn't go.
What was the difference between Urban Renewal and Model Cities?
Well, Model Cities was a federal program that they had issued this money, and so it was these cities got this money, and we were to help the kids in the community, and we were to help with jobs, help them with job training, which we did. We would get people to hire the kids in high school so that they would have on-the-job training. We worked with the CETA program, which was to help you with employment and on-the-job training. And so Model Cities started out, they gave these different cities this money to help the youth and to improve the community, which it did. We did a lot of things for the community, and people joined in and helped, and we made sure that the kids were connected, to different, so they could get employment other than doing little odd jobs.
So the Model Cities program,
but that came after Urban Renewal.
Great. I appreciate that clarification, because I found Model Cities looks to me like it was from 1971, 1971, and to maybe 1979, the federal funding stopped.
Somewhere in there.
Somewhere in there. And I did find an article from 71 where Henry Bryant Jr., he was a board candidate for the Model Cities Policy Board. These were elected positions. And he expressed concern. It sounds like he feared that model cities could turn into effectively an urban renewal kind of program. So this is what he says. He says, when the bulldozer enters the model cities neighborhood in the next few years during city expansion, don't say I didn't tell you so. So did you witness some of that skepticism around what they said model cities would be? And in the beginning, I guess, was there skepticism around what this program actually meant?
Well, there was skepticism. But from my point of view, as someone that was active in the community and also worked for model cities, it seemed like they kind of flaunted this money to us to keep us black people divided, because you had some black Republicans that didn't think the money was being used wisely. And
was the Packard Beakes Bypass considered a part of urban renewal?
Yes.
Oh, it was. Okay.
It was the reason, but then it got knocked down. But then the city came through and took many houses and convinced people to sell their houses, and so a lot of people lost their property. But the thing was, a lot of people, such as my stepfather, $10,000, you can buy another house for $10,000.
Yeah. Wow.
So during that time, we also had our public housing came into play through the federal government. That was all part of urban renewal, because several cities were putting in these bypasses and these freeways, and so a lot of people ended up in public housing because they didn't have enough money to go buy a house.
Now, at that point in time, what did it look like? What did public housing look like in Ann Arbor?
Just like it looks now, because we rallied. Their first proposal, they being the city, was to build a big high-rise with a big fence around it. And we were like, no.
Wow.
You are not going to concentrate us like that. So we protested against that, we being the community, and insisted on scattered sites. And that's how we got North Maple, South Maple, all the different, Green Road, High Cone. So those were our scattered sites. And then we also had a program called the Turnkey 3 program, where it was like a rent to own. That's where you got the Garden Circle properties. They were homes, LaSalle off of Packard.
Oh, okay.
We still have these homes, but in the 80s, what they did, they paid rent.
Okay.
At a lower cost. And part of the rent went in an escrow account. And then when you were ready, you thought you were ready to purchase that house, they were selling them back then. Now, this was back in the 70s, for $25,000.
Wow.
So now you don't have that program. Everybody owns their home. It came, I think it was in the 80s. You either had to buy it off or move. The city decided.
And this was at Garden Circle in LaSalle, or
all the Turnkey 3, wherever the houses.
Okay, all the Turnkey 3.
Yeah, I'm saying Garden Circle, and then on LaSalle and Lafier. They're scattered around the city, but they all were built the same, so they look the same. Such as, and I'm throwing this in, Ora Rosser lived with her boyfriend in one of the homes.
What an interesting connection.
Yes. And so her boyfriend, he was living in his mother's home, which was one of the
that presumably she had purchased through the Turnkey program.
Yes.
Wow.
So there's all kinds of little connectors to everything I grew up here, so there's a lot of things I know just from growing up here.
In part 2, Shirley talks about violent incidents she witnessed in Ann Arbor public schools and at our public parks, concerns that she and others raised about the treatment of Black children in our community. Like and subscribe if you'd like to be alerted to more content like this.